Ravi was a boy who carried laziness like a second skin. It clung to him in every movement, every decision, every day that passed by. When the roosters crowed at dawn, calling the villagers to wake up and begin their work, Ravi would simply roll over on his charpai and cover his face with a thin blanket, as though the morning light was an enemy trying to rob him of his dreams. His father, a hard-working farmer, would already be out in the fields by the time the sun rose, plowing the land, sowing seeds, or watering the crops. Ravi knew this, but he never moved. The most he would do was stretch his arms lazily, yawn, and promise himself, maybe tomorrow, I'll wake up early. Maybe tomorrow, I'll help him. But tomorrow never came. The villagers had grown used to seeing Ravi in the same way every day, leaning against the porch, half asleep, or strolling idly by the river, skipping stones while others carried water on their heads. The shopkeepers laughed whenever they saw him passing by, muttering, "There goes the lazy boy. Always dreaming, never doing." Even his teachers at school had given up hope. He was bright, but his brightness was covered with the dust of delay, the weight of excuses, and the shadow of endless naps. He would begin his homework only when his mother threatened to hide his food, and even then, he did it carelessly, rushing through lines so he could rest again. It wasn't that Ravi didn't dream. In fact, he dreamed a lot. He dreamed of being strong, of being respected, of living in the city one day and making his family proud. But his dreams lived only in his mind. They never reached his hands, his feet, or his heart. Every time he thought about working hard, a louder voice whispered, "Later, you can do it later." That word, later, became his constant companion, and slowly, his life began slipping away in wasted hours. One hot afternoon, as the sun scorched the earth and the cattle dragged themselves back to the shade, Ravi lay sprawled on the porch of his small house, staring lazily at the sky. The wind carried with it the laughter of other children who were busy playing after finishing their chores. His younger sister, Meena, came running to him, her face sweaty and dusty from helping their mother fetch water. She dropped the heavy pot she was carrying and looked at her brother with frustration. "Brother," she said, her voice sharp but full of concern, "do you not feel ashamed?" Ravi lazily turned his head, half smiling, as if her words were just another game. "Ashamed? Why should I? I am comfortable. Isn't comfort the best thing in life?" Meena shook her head. "No, comfort is earned. Look around you. Even the sun works every single day. It rises without fail, gives light and warmth, and then sets only to rise again. The birds wake before dawn to search for food. Father sweats in the fields from morning till evening so that we can eat. And you waste every hour, every chance. One day, people will remember you only as the boy who did nothing. Is that how you want to live?" Her words were like an arrow piercing through the fog of Ravi's laziness. For a moment, he wanted to laugh it off, to brush away her seriousness. But something about the way she spoke, the disappointment in her young eyes, struck him deeply. He had never thought about life in that way. To him, the sun was just a ball of fire that annoyed him by shining into his room too early. To him, birds were noisy creatures that disturbed his sleep. But now, with Meena's words, he suddenly saw them differently. The sun is a symbol of duty, the birds as reminders of responsibility, his father as a silent example of strength. Ravi turned his face away, pretending not to care, but his heart felt heavy. For the first time in his life, laziness didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like chains that kept him tied to the ground while the world moved ahead without him. He closed his eyes, and instead of drifting into sleep, he found himself wondering, what if my sister is right? What if one day I am remembered as nothing more than a lazy shadow? That evening, as the golden light of sunset bathed the village, Ravi lay still on the porch, but this time he was not asleep. His mind was restless, his chest uneasy. Meena's words echoed again and again, "Even the sun works every single day." He felt a spark, small and weak, but alive. For the first time in his life, he thought that maybe, just maybe, it was time to change. That week, something unusual stirred in the quiet village. A group of elders announced a competition during the festival. Anyone strong enough to lift a great stone and carry it across the field would win not only a prize but also the chance to be recommended for the city academy. For the young boys of the village, this was a golden opportunity. Joining the academy meant a doorway to a brighter future, respect, and the chance to rise above the ordinary life of farming and labor. The news spread quickly. Excited whispers filled the streets. Children practiced carrying heavy sacks, and men tested their strength by lifting logs and boulders near the riverbank. But whenever Ravi's name came up in conversation, the villagers would laugh. Ravi, the lazy one, he won't even lift his own blanket in the morning, how will he lift a stone? The words cut like blades of mockery, but Ravi kept his face expressionless. Outwardly, he showed no anger, but inside, something burned. That night, as the village prepared for sleep and the moonlight stretched across the rooftops, Ravi lay awake in his bed. He stared at the thatched ceiling, his heart restless. His sister's words echoed again in his ears, louder than ever, even the sun works every single day. He turned from side to side, unable to push away the thought of being remembered as nothing but a useless dreamer. The laughter of the villagers haunted him, their voices echoing, "Lazy boy, lazy boy." Finally, he sat up, his eyes fierce with an emotion he barely recognized, determination. For the first time, he whispered to himself, "Am I going to live like this forever? Or will I prove, even once, that I can do something?" The next morning, before the first rooster crowed, Ravi did something he had never done before. He woke up early. The world was still half asleep, the stars faintly glowing in the sky, when he stepped outside. His father, surprised to see him awake, raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Ravi walked past him toward the riverbank, where small stones and boulders lay scattered. At first, he bent down to lift a medium-sized stone. His arms trembled, his back strained, and within seconds the stone slipped from his grasp, falling to the ground with a dull thud. His body ached, and for a moment, he almost gave up. But then he remembered the laughter, the mocking eyes of the villagers, and his sister's disappointment. Gritting his teeth, he tried again. This time, he held the stone a little longer, took 2 steps before it dropped. His palms were sore, his shoulders burned, yet inside him, something grew stronger. Day after day, Ravi returned to the riverbank at dawn. He started with smaller stones, carrying them as far as he could. Slowly, his arms gained strength, his back grew firm, and his breath grew steadier. At first, no one noticed. He trained in secret, away from the eyes of those who would laugh at him. The sun rose each morning to find Ravi sweating by the river, his clothes drenched, his face glowing with effort. His hands developed calluses, his muscles began to show, and his laziness started to fade like mist under the morning light. One evening, as he returned home, his sister caught him wiping sweat from his forehead. She tilted her head curiously. "What have you been doing?" she asked. Ravi smiled faintly but did not answer. For the first time, he didn't want to explain himself with words. He wanted his actions to speak. The day of the competition drew closer. The village buzzed with excitement, drums echoed through the streets, and boys boasted about their strength. Ravi remained quiet, but his eyes carried a fire no one had seen before. He no longer spent afternoons lying on the porch. Instead, he disappeared at dawn and returned with tired eyes but an unshakable calmness. On the night before the contest, Ravi sat alone in his small room. A dim lantern flickered beside him, casting shadows on the mud walls. He looked at his rough hands, covered with scratches and blisters, and for once, he felt proud. The old Ravi, the lazy Ravi, would have laughed at the idea of preparing for anything. But the new Ravi was ready. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, they will see. Tomorrow, I will not be the lazy boy anymore." And with that thought, he finally slept. Not the heavy sleep of carelessness, but the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who had discovered purpose. The morning of the competition arrived with the sound of drums and laughter echoing through the village square. Flags of bright colors fluttered in the breeze, and the villagers gathered in excitement, forming a large circle around the field where the great stone had been placed. It sat in the center, massive and unyielding, like a silent challenge waiting for its champion. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, men and women murmured with anticipation, and the elders watched with folded arms, ready to judge the strength and courage of their youth. One by one, the boys of the village stepped forward. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, a farmer's son who often carried sacks of grain. He bent low, wrapped his arms around the stone, and strained with all his might. His face turned red, his muscles bulged, but after a few seconds, he dropped it back to the ground, gasping. The crowd clapped politely. Another boy tried, then another, and another. Each gave their best, but none could carry the stone more than a few steps. The challenge was proving too great. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ravi stepped forward. A hush fell over the crowd. The lazy boy, the one who wasted his days sleeping on the porch. Whispers spread quickly. He won't even budge it. Is he here just to make us laugh? What a fool. Even some of the boys who had failed grinned, expecting Ravi to humiliate himself. Ravi walked steadily to the center, his eyes fixed on the stone. Inside, his heart pounded, but his hands did not tremble. Weeks of silent practice had led to this moment. He crouched, tightened his grip, and closed his eyes for a brief second. In that silence, he heard his sister's voice once again, "Even the sun works every single day." He drew in a deep breath, and with a roar that came from the depths of his chest, he lifted. The stone rose slowly, inch by inch, heavier than anything he had carried before. His arms quivered, his shoulders screamed with pain, and sweat poured down his face. For a terrifying moment, he thought he would drop it like all the others. But then he remembered the laughter, the insults, the image of his father working alone in the fields, and the disappointment in his sister's eyes. No, he told himself. Not this time. Step by step, Ravi began to move. The stone pressed against his body, digging into his skin, but he pushed forward. The crowd gasped. This was the boy they had mocked, the one they had written off as hopeless. And yet here he was, carrying the burden no one else could. Every step was a battle, every breath a storm, but Ravi's determination burned brighter than the pain. Halfway across the field, his legs nearly gave out. His vision blurred, his knees wobbled, and he staggered dangerously. The crowd murmured, some already assuming he would fail. But then, through the blur, Ravi caught sight of Meena standing at the edge of the field, her small hands clasped together, her eyes wide with hope. That single look gave him strength greater than any muscle. He gritted his teeth, let out another cry, and pressed forward. Finally, with one last step, he crossed the finish line. He let the stone drop with a thunderous thud, and the ground shook beneath it. For a second, there was silence, pure, stunned silence. Then the entire field erupted in cheers, clapping, and shouts of amazement. The villagers who once mocked him now stood with admiration in their eyes. Children chanted his name, elders nodded in approval, and even those who had laughed the loudest were left speechless. Ravi stood tall, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, but his face glowed with triumph. He had done what no one believed he could. He was no longer the lazy boy. He was the boy who had fought against himself, against the chains of laziness, against the weight of excuses, and had won. His father walked forward, pride shining in his tired eyes, and placed a hand on Ravi's shoulder. His sister ran to him, her face bright with tears, whispering, "I knew you could do it." Ravi smiled, but said nothing. Words were no longer needed, his actions had spoken louder than any promise. From that day forward, the village never called him lazy again. Instead, they spoke of him as the boy who had transformed, the boy who proved that determination can turn weakness into strength. Ravi himself never forgot the lesson he had learned. Laziness is a burden heavier than any stone, but once you rise against it, nothing in the world can hold you back. As the sun set behind the hills that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ravi looked up and thought of his sister's words once more. Yes, the sun worked every day, and now, so would he.